Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Advancing Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Work Family Research, bringing marginalized identities to the forefront. I'm Jen Hook, WFRN's Vice President, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this virtual conference event on behalf of WFRN's leadership team, our President Ellen Galinsky, Executive Director Steve Sweet, and especially our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Subcommittee who organized today's event. I also want to recognize the sponsorship of the Population Research Institute at Penn State University. I'm pleased to introduce you to the organizers and presiders of today's event, Ameeta Jaga, Professor of Organizational Psychology and Commerce Faculty Deputy Dean of Transformation and Inclusion at the University of Cape Town, and Krista Lynn Minnotte, Professor of Sociology at the University of North Dakota. Before handing things off to Krista Lynn, I want to acknowledge that by joining us today, you are consenting to recording. The recording will be posted on our website for those who can't be joining us in person today. I also want to acknowledge that events are made possible by the very generous support of our members. If you're not a member yet, I encourage you to check out our website to learn more about WFRN and the benefits of membership. And I'll pop a link to membership in the chat. And finally, please save the date for our next VCS event on May 12th, Work Family Justice for LGBTQ+ individuals, identifying and overcoming barriers to inclusivity in practice and research. And with that, a warm welcome to everyone, and over to you, Krista Lynn.
Thank you so much, Jen. Welcome, everyone. Like Jennifer, I'm just delighted that we have so many people here today to be a part of this event. Before getting going, I'd like to extend gratitude to a few individuals. First, I'd like to thank Ameeta Jaga for all her efforts to get this event going and off the ground. I'd like to thank the EDI subcommittee for all their efforts, and I'd like to thank Steve Sweet, Raven Chandler, Sarah Damaski, and Richard Petz for all their efforts behind the scenes with these virtual conference series events. And of course, I'd like to thank the presenters for their fantastic work that they'll be sharing with us today, and for WFRN for bringing us all together in community. So we have 5 excellent presentations today. We'll go ahead and proceed in the order listed in the event announcement, and we'll save questions and discussions until the end. So our first presenter today is Sylvia Fuller, Professor of Sociology at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver campus. The floor is yours, Sylvia.
Great. Thanks, everybody, and thank you for being here. We have a very tight timeline, so I will just jump right in here and start my slides. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. So the evolving COVID-19 pandemic has posed challenges for parents. In the first stage, parents face both frightening new health risks and disruptions to employment, to schooling, and to care arrangements. Not surprisingly, multiple studies across countries found particularly marked declines in mental health among parents, especially among mothers, in the early stages of the pandemic. But as the pandemic evolved, so too did stressors. And we know less about the mental health impacts of the pandemic later on in these later stages. So today I'm going to share with you some work in progress that's looking at parents' mental health and the work-family interface in Canada, with a particular emphasis today on the intersection of gender and household risk. So our data was collected in Canada at the end of summer in 2021. Vaccines have been rolled out. To bring yourself back to that time frame. They'd been rolled out for adults, but they weren't yet available for kids. The school year was about to begin, but what, if any, safety protocols would be in place was unclear across much of the country. As we can see from this chart of hospitalizations for COVID, which mirrored transmission rates, albeit at a bit of a lag, hospitalizations were quite low at that time, much lower than now, but were rising. It was the beginning of the Delta wave. We surveyed parents in Canada, sorry, I went a little bit too fast there, with at least one child under 10, asking a range of questions about their work-family circumstances in the pandemic, and this was part of a larger cross-national study. So for the analysis that I'm discussing today, we use a global self-assessment to capture mental health and compare outcomes by gender and those living in high-risk families. Now, we focus on risk here at the household level as pandemic risks and constraints reverberate for the entire household, not just the person who is clinically vulnerable. Now, being high risk in the pandemic has a biomedical basis, of course. And while we treat it as a binary here, there's significant variation within this category. It isn't a hard line, nor do people always have an accurate understanding of their actual individual or household risk of poor outcomes. Moreover, we want to emphasize, as Martha Feynman has in her work on vulnerability and policy, and as disability scholars have highlighted more broadly, that vulnerability is both universal and particular, and is shaped by social and political circumstances and choices. So individual resources to reduce risks vary, such as having money for pandemic protections like high quality respirators, devices to measure CO2 quality in the air, which is a proxy for how much shared air you're breathing back in, less crowded living conditions, supportive and careful family and friends. And broader social contexts also shape risk in very important ways, such as the ability to work from home, to access and manage remote schooling, to send your child to a school or a childcare center where there are measures in place to curb transmission. In our analysis, we looked at a number of key covariates indexing pandemic-related changes relevant for the work-family interface that we expected could impact parents' mental health. And we're influenced here broadly by the stress process model, which highlights the interconnection among stressors and the importance of considering their collective impact. Now, I can't go over these in any kind of detail given the time constraints, but broadly, we looked at primary stressors tied to loss of resources to manage the work-home interface, employment disruptions and their downstream relation to changed employment statuses, the further proliferation of stress via changes in perceived career prospects and difficulties balancing work and care, and indicators of reduced social support and family functioning that may result from the proliferation of these other pandemic stressors. So to start, let's simply compare reported mental health. And again, this is respondents' reports of their mental health currently and how they assess this in the pre-pandemic time across gender and these high-risk family groups. And we see that all groups of parents reported lower mental health currently compared to their retrospective reports of their pre-pandemic mental health. This was consistent across all these parental and high-risk status groups. However, the starting points are lower and the declines are greater for mothers. The starting points are also lower for parents in high-risk families, and the declines are also greater for mothers in this group relative to other mothers. Now, to explore these gaps further, we use a Kitagawa-Oaxaca blinder decomposition, and this allows us to see the extent to which group differences are attributable to differences in means for factors that affect mental health, that's endowments in the decomposition language. So one group being more likely, for example, to have experienced job losses, and to what extent gaps reflect differences in the relationship between covariates and mental health across groups. So if being unemployed is more damaging to mental health for one group versus another. So for the purpose of time, I'm just going to show you our decomposition results comparing mothers across families with and without high-risk household members. And recall that we tested quite a lot of covariates, and here we're just showing those that contributed to the mental health gap. So starting with endowments, we see that declines in work-care balance and family functioning matter. Both are worse for mothers in high-risk families and are bad for mental health. And there's also some notable coefficient differences. So reduced work hours and school care closures were less negative for the mental health of moms in high-risk families. So the reduction to COVID risk that's inherent in these experiences likely offset their otherwise stressful impact. On the other hand, being furloughed, that's temporarily laid off, was much worse. It was neutral for non-high-risk mothers and very negative for mothers in high-risk families. More time with the child out of care due to isolation requirements was also worse, as was shouldering more of an increased care burden relative to one's partner. Now, in our analysis, we treated assessment of pre-pandemic mental health as a control, but it's worth noting that mothers in high-risk families not only reported a lower pre-pandemic baseline, but the reporting lower pre-pandemic mental health was also more strongly related to poor current mental health for them. So what do we make of these results, and how might we think about this research more broadly in the context of EDI? So first, throughout the pandemic, there's been a real emphasis on getting back to normal for the sake of people's mental health. Our research reminds us that this is a perspective that risks privileging those least at risk and whose mental health has been the least impacted. Circumstances that led to a loss of key resources, but also reduced COVID risk exposure, were sometimes protective of mental health rather than stressors for mothers with high-risk family members. Health status, which overlaps with but's not reducible to disability, it's conventionally understood, is an important axis of inequality in pandemic times. Now, for some, the availability of vaccines and Paxlovid has changed the risk landscape, at least when it comes to the acute risk of death from the immediate phase of the infection. So I expect that many families who would have identified as having a high-risk family member back when we surveyed them might not identify so today, or might view these risks as much lower. And that's, of course, a good thing. But for those who remain at high risk, like those for whom vaccines provide limited protection due to severe immunocompromise, and the many for whom Paxlovid is contraindicated, the situation has actually deteriorated as the continued unchecked transmission and mutation of the virus has rendered all monoclonal antibody treatments ineffective at this time. And of course, avoiding infection has become much more difficult and costly, especially for families with younger children. With protective measures dropped, we see persistent high baseline COVID transmission. These costs, of course, aren't just financial, they're also social for parents and especially kids. The burden of being different, of wearing a mask when others aren't, of missing out on extracurriculars, of enduring microaggressions, and of perceiving oneself as not mattering in this broader context where folks are going on and moving on and leaving you behind. Those costs are rising for people. And this puts kids and their parents in high-risk families in a really difficult position, as they're increasingly not only forced to choose between continued isolation and serious risk, but also more and more stigmatized as fearful weirdos. So I'm out of time. I had some more reflections to add, but I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to further conversation as we move on. And I want to make sure I leave time for all the other great people on the panel.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sylvia, for that informative presentation. Our next presenter is Konjit Gudeta, a postdoctoral researcher and Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Maastricht University, the Netherlands. We are eager to see your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I still don't have very much time to say a lot, but I will just try to present a part of a research project that I'm working as a postdoc, and it's on the well-being of female employees at the bottom of the global value chains. So just to give you a bit of a background. Okay. The global value chains or global production networks are expanding and increasingly going to the global south countries, particularly in Africa. And these companies or foreign direct that are established through foreign direct investment are increasingly creating employment, particularly for women. And it's mostly, when reported in research findings, it's talked about positively as giving them source of, or being a source of livelihood, creating opportunities, employment opportunities, particularly for women who otherwise wouldn't have a chance for formal employment. But on the other hand, there are also some reports that show its exploitative nature, in which because they are being given low wage and also less decent and work environments, and sometimes exposure to harmful substances and so on. So there is these findings and reports about the employment, but in general, such employment is kind of championed for creating employment opportunities and for as a means, a way out of poverty for most in global South countries. But when looking at literature, still workers are often described as passive contributors of production rather than as active key players in these chains, and less emphasis is given to the broader conditions that affect their overall well-being in general. And most importantly, what's missing in literature is the women's voices and listening to what these women actually feel and believe and think is important to their well-being. Their own experiences and their accounts is missing from the literature, or there is an increasing interest, but there is very less understanding on this issue. So the project, which is a three-way project, Women, Work and Well-being in Ethiopia project, is set out to explore the women's well-being as experienced and as reported by them. So why Ethiopia in particular? Looking at the context, Ethiopia is one of the top destinations for FDI in Africa, located in the eastern part of the continent. And there are currently more than 200,000 jobs created through foreign direct investment initiated firms, mostly characterized as labor intensive and populated by women in the country. And the two large two sectors that are employing women in large numbers are flower farms, or the horticulture industry, and also the apparel and textile sector. Ethiopia is often characterized as a patriarchal society when women account for half of the population, but often lacking most of the opportunities and found in a bit of a disadvantaged position in terms of education, employment, and other characteristics compared to their male counterparts. And it's also characterized as collectivist society where there are normative gender and community role expectations imposed on these women. So additional care responsibilities are expected from the women. So the project has three components that I will be mainly talking about on particularly one, which is a qualitative part of it, a qualitative ethnographic study conducted as part of the three-way project, where we have conducted more than spoken with 64 female workers in these two sectors, and mainly conducted through phone because of the COVID pandemic. We were not able to get physical access to these women. And the women have considerably varied background characteristics in terms of their age, in terms of their education background. We talked to women with no formal education, who has a diploma, or were university students, and so on. So we had quite a lot of data, qualitative data, which we analyzed qualitatively following thematic analysis, to get some insights and to learn more about their well-being, what they believe is important to their well-being. So this is just a work in progress that I'm just trying to cite to talk about few of the key findings that I believe are relevant to today's discussion. And what we find over and again, speaking with these women, is their life, which is highly characterized with and highly filled with uncertainties, and these uncertainties largely in their present life, and also when thinking and describing and talking about their future, is basically as a result of a number of factors. One is a low wage that they are receiving, and ever rising prices of, costs of the living in the country, and also recent conflicts, particularly in the northern part of the country, and ethnic-based clashes here and there, creating a challenge for these women and unable to see a future, to aspire for the future and have hope and set goals and move forward in their future. So making it very much difficult for these women to think about their future. One other aspect relevant, also related to their employment, is disruptions in their employment. So uncertainties about their employment. One thing that could be cited is factories were closing down by abrupt cancellation of one trade agreement between Ethiopia and the United States, which AGOA agreement. And there is specifically looking at the relationships and what these women feel and believe is important. We identified that relationships are highly important for these women, in giving them, a means to live by, and also contributing for these women positively, and in other cases also impacting and negatively, affecting the women's well-being. their relationships with family, with co-workers, managers, co-workers being their peers, and also manager, senior, and also supervisors, as well as a broader environment where we see political instability and others. And uniquely described by most women is also their relationship with God as well, which often gives them so much hope when they are confronted with so much uncertainty in their life, and when they cannot foresee the future, and when they cannot anticipate for the future, but highly relying and somehow getting closer to their faith and leaving everything in the hands of God. One woman, she says, she keeps hoping on top of hope, although she knows that whatever she's hoping for is not materializing, but she keeps hoping on top of hope, because that's the only thing that gets her going, and so on. And the relationship is a source of, contributor for their material, psychological, emotional, and many more means of support, improving their well-being. And in certain cases, particularly their relationship with expat managers, senior managers, they are confronted with a number of, challenges which somehow affect the women's well-being, and also, giving them, leading them to somehow have the intention to leave their employment, and ultimately to resulting in turnover because of the harsh treatment, scolding, and a number of things. In general, maybe related to what we're discussing today, we've seen varied experiences among women, but whenever we see in little literature that talks about these women, it talks about them as one homogeneous group, but they are not. There are varieties in terms of challenge that they experience, in terms of the aspirations and expectations, what they have for the future. There are few who just lost hope for the future, and there are few who are very much hopeful and look forward and taking their employment as a stepping stone for something better, rather than something that they can simply may stay at. But in general, there is lack of equity that we see. There's no fairness in terms of the access, opportunity for advancement for these women, and particularly in terms of the pay. They are not earning as much as they should, and that's making it very much difficult, although this has been reported in a number of places already. But the diversity aspect, understanding the diversity of experiences should help in considering interventions. There are various interventions going on by organizations and other agencies, but that lacks understanding of the diversity of these women's experiences and their voice. It needs to be heard. True representation of these women is important, which is not happening currently for them. Intercultural sensitivities is also what's lacking. Most of the expat managers are from other countries, Asian countries like China, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on, which, because of the cultural variations, these women are facing negative experiences in their work environment. I think that's about it shortly. Thank you, and I will leave the floor.
Thank you so much, Konjit, for that informative presentation. Our next presenters are Nicole Denier, and an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Alberta, and Yang Hu, a professor of sociology at Lancaster University.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my slides here. Okay. There we go. Okay, thank you so much for having us today. I'll just jump in. Our talk today is part of this bigger project funded through the Canada-UK Artificial Intelligence Initiative to examine bias in digitalized labor market processes and how AI might deal with persistent policy issues in the labor market, like marginalization and inequality. By design, we're interested in learning from experiences in Canada and the UK, which are similar in many ways, including that both have explicit AI policies that highlight fairness as core to AI development. So our interdisciplinary and cross-national team is trying to both generate and integrate domain-specific knowledge about the labor market to develop relevant AI that may address biases. The focus of our talk today is understanding how inequality may be generated or mitigated at the hiring stage of the labor market in particular. And this is a critical question because job search is increasingly digitalized, with both employers recruiting on online search platforms like Indeed or Monster. And these infrastructures have potential to expand applicant pools, which is typically seen as a hallmark of equity policies. At the same time, work in linguistics and psychology shows that how job postings are worded influences how job seekers perceive their fit for the job and even their likelihood of applying. And there's been a lot of that work focusing on gender in particular. Our presentation today speaks to a couple of broad concerns. First, by considering other types of language that may be important at the advertising stage, right? We know that labor markets are not only stratified by gender, but by race, sexuality, immigration status, and of course, family status. So we'll expand thinking beyond gender. And secondarily, we're interested in whether we can develop context-specific understandings of bias that may inform more open debiasing practices and tools. With that said, we'll address 4 questions. The first, to what extent are labor markets in these 2 countries actually digitalized? Second, what sorts of biases, organizational EDI, and work-family initiatives are present in job advertisements? So what do employers actually advertise that they're offering? Third, what are the relationships between these sorts of advertisements, how employers position themselves, and actual gender and racial segregation in the labor market? And finally, which my colleague Yang Hu will tackle, how do we combine domain expertise in AI data science to mitigate biases and promote EDI? So to answer these questions, we turn to a fairly complete set of job postings in Canada and the United Kingdom, and we used a mixed methods approach to identifying sources of inequality in the job ads. We begin with 5 expert coders who examined a random sample of postings for biases and labor market inequality domains that we had been familiarized with. We then compared our expert coding with keyword and topic searches of articles published in top sociology and work family journals, and then expanded this expert coded word list of biases, organizational EDI initiatives, and work family balance indicators through supervised learning and pre-trained word embedding models like GLOVE to look for words with semantic similarities, ultimately yielding scores for each of the postings that reflected the level of biased language or EDI cues present in the postings. With this, we estimated structural equation models to look at how the biases and EDI cues in the job postings related to gender and racial composition of occupations within industries and the labor market more broadly by linking that our job postings to census data in the 2 countries. So to answer our first question, we developed this digitalization index, which we calculate by dividing the proportion of all online job ads represented by an industry or occupation by the proportion of the full labor force formed of workers in that industry or occupation. A value above 1 means that an industry or occupation is relatively more digitalized than the labor market average, and a value below 1 indicates a below average level of digitalization. So you can see here that across industries in both countries, the primary and secondary industries are less likely to engage in digitalized search than are the services. We also observe an occupational gradient in digitalization, with it less common at both the top and the bottom of the occupational hierarchy, and more common in the middle of the occupational distribution. So we see a sort of uneven impact of digitalization on the workforce, with some relatively immune from and others locked into digital practices that may accentuate or mitigate biases. We next turn to fitting structural equation models with gender and racial composition in occupation industry groups as dependent variables, and the scores for the 6 dimensions of EDI or biases as key predictors. Notably, our key predictors here go beyond explicit gender-biased language to include gendered psychological traits, gendered work role cues relating to tasks that are highly feminized, and work-family cues that reflect whether jobs offer support for work-family balance. We further look at explicit DEI pledges, as well as more informal commitments to DEI expressed through supportive cultures, investments in employees, and mission-driven workplaces. Overall, I'll spotlight here 2 high-level trends in this rather complex graph. The first basic finding is that masculine-oriented language, both explicit and subtle, is associated with a greater proportion of men in the occupation or industry group. In Canada and Canada only, masculine-oriented language is also associated with a lower proportion of visible minority or non-white people in an occupation industry grouping. The second major pattern is that DEI workplace cultural cues are associated with greater women's representation and racial, ethnic, visible minority representation in occupational industrial groups in both countries. But explicit DEI pledges have a very weak effect and only in the UK. We can then turn to the partial R-squared values to see how much of these domains matter for explaining overall variation in occupational, industrial, gender, and racial composition. What's really notable here is that it's very clear that the explicit cues, either in terms of gender or explicit DEI pledges, explain very little of the variation in gender or racial composition of the labor force. Instead, it's more subtle linguistic cues that are associated with larger differences in terms of both gender and race. This points to the importance of considering more fine-grained indicators or expressions of organizational culture in setting the tone for diversity, equity, inclusion, and hiring. And with that, I'll turn to Yang to quickly provide some insights into how to do that.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, everyone. So what can we do about the biases? There are a new host of artificial intelligence-powered tools aimed at debiasing job adverts, not the least what we are seeing now, ChatGPT. However, algorithms trained on general corpora, such as Wikipedia, are not attuned or sensitive to the labor market context, such as work-family issues, which we know to be important. Our bias detection and mitigation takes into account meaningful dimensions in the labor market, some of the dimensions Nicole just presented, such as role descriptions and work-family policies. And we don't just look for what's biased, but also what can be positive. Then we use the meaningful and positive cues to offset, replace, balance off the negative ones. On the screen, the graph shows a snapshot of the distributions of gender biases, for example, before and after our bias mitigation in the UK. As you will see, our domain-specific algorithm does a really good job in reducing the biases from the top to the bottom. And we're in the process of developing an open source toolkit to be rolled out later in the year. But if you're interested in the debiasing process, please feel free to check out our technical paper as shown on the screen. So Nicole, next. Thank you. So I'll just quickly sum up the 5 takeaways from our project. First of all, biased language in job adverts is closely associated with labor force gender and racial segregation. And our ongoing analysis not shown here shows that job adverts causally shape labor force composition, but at the same time, a diverse labor force also write less biased and more pro-EDI job adverts. Despite this bidirectionality, we cannot change the composition of the labor force without changing the gatekeeping process that filters people into the labor force. And second, we need to go beyond gender pronouns and psychological cues that has been the focus of research for a long time. we see that work, family, and EDI cues, they do matter a lot. In a wide range of countries, regulations are passed to diversify language use in job adverts. But our findings show that window dressing policy pledges matter little, but EDI workplace culture as represented in the job adverts, they matter a lot. Fourth, intersectionality matters as well. Given the gendered construction of racial identities, gender cues shape the racial composition of the labor force, and EDI cues matter for both gender and racial segregation. Finally, we show that mitigation is possible, but it cannot be left to automated artificial intelligence. We need supervised machine learning, and the supervision will need to draw on expert knowledge of labor market and EDI. So in conclusion, it takes data scientists probably to design ChatGPT and artificial intelligence, but us, work family scholars, to make artificial intelligence work for us all. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your important work with us. Our next presenter is Hoyjin Saw, a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Sociological Research at KU Leuven, Belgium.
Thank you. I hope you're able to see my screen. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my research and be able to be part of this very fantastic presentations. Today's presentation will be on the research that was recently published in the Journal of European Social Policy, and this will be a very brief summary of the findings there. And if you have any more, if you are interested in any details, I would recommend you to go and read the paper. But today's presentation will be quite brief, just so you know. So to start with some background knowledge that we are all aware of. So we have seen an increase in women's labor market participation over the last few decades, although the gap still exists, but the increase was still there. And scholars have found that there are some associations between the employment rate of women and the family policies, the development of family policies, or the expansion of it, or the different designs of it. However, the question that I had in this regard was, how about the types or the quality of the jobs that women have once they enter the labor market? It is because we continue to see women more likely to be in low-paid or atypical jobs with a lack of prospects for advancement, or what we could call labor market outsiders. So the main research question that I had was, does family policy impact the types of jobs that women have? And in this particular presentation, I will focus on what I mean by the types of jobs and how I analyzed it, and the impact of the family policy. More specifically for the family policy, I look at the policies with different assumptions on gender roles have different impacts, but that's more or less the subcategory of this research question. So in terms of types of jobs, I conducted a latent class analysis on the European Working Conditions Survey from 2015 with 5 different indicators of what it means to be an outsider. And based on that, I was able to find 4 different types of jobs in European labor market. I looked at 30 different European countries for your information. Firstly, I found a group of workers, so roughly 58% of the European working workers that resembled the characteristics of what we already know as the insiders. So they work full-time in secure employment, they feel secure about their jobs, they have decent income, and they have relatively high prospects of advancement. And then I found 3 different types of outsiders that deviate from the security that these insiders enjoy. So if you look at the very right-hand side, there is what I label typical outsiders, and they have a more or less typical characteristics of the outsiders, which are insecure employment, low income, and lack of prospects. And then there's dead-end insiders who have secure employment, low income, and low prospects for advancement. And then, although small group, there is a group I labeled subjective outsiders who have secure employment, decent income, but for some reason they feel insecure about these jobs. And based on these 4 segment or for a framework, I wanted to look at how the labor market in Europe is then gendered. And this is the first set of findings that I had. And to briefly go over these figures, the main idea behind it is that men are more likely to be the insiders in the labor market compared to women who are more likely to be outsiders as a whole. However, women are especially more likely to be the dead-end insiders, who are, these group of workers are in general more likely to be the mid-aged workers or the mothers in the labor market. For the typical outsiders, women are more likely than men to be typical outsiders, and these workers in general are more likely to be the young workers in the labor market. So young workers are more likely to be in the typical outsider jobs, but women are more likely to be in this group. Although, as I mentioned, this group is quite small, the subjective outsiders, more men are likely to belong to this group compared to women. And then I looked at if these kind of gender patterns are different across different countries, and then I was able to find some cross-national variations. But what these figures shows is that women are indeed more likely to be outsiders belong to any of these three outsider jobs compared to men in all of the 30 European countries that I examined, but to a different extent. So for example, in Austria, what we can see is that women are 2.6 times more likely than men to belong to the outsider jobs, whereas in Portugal, women are 1.2 times more likely to be outsiders compared to men. And then I wanted to look at how the family policies then would influence these kind of, or would be associated with these kind of cross-national variations. And I categorized the policies into three different groups, and one based on the different assumptions of gender roles they have within the married couples or more the heterosexual couples in this case. So the more traditional family model policies will refer to having more emphasis on the mothers taking leaves, and the dual care model policies would refer to the policies that promote fathers taking leaves, and dual earner model would refer to the having a more extensive childcare services for children under the age of 3. Some of the key significant findings that I found based on the multi-level analysis in this research are summarized here. And firstly, I found that the generous family policy, in this case referring to the family policy expenditure by the governments, has been associated with women's higher likelihood of being outsiders, which could seem a bit counterintuitive. But it could be explained when we look into the specific policies. So what I found is that there are some policies that have been associated with more women entering the labor market. However, these set of policies are also associated with more women in low income and dead-end jobs, from which we can infer that these increase in labor market participation could have been driven by them entering into low income dead-end jobs. And also with the part-time childcare services, when there's more part-time childcare services in a country, we found more women in low income dead-end jobs as well. So what does this mean? What can we learn from these findings? For one thing, it does not mean the family policy is not important or it is a cause of these women's feminization of outsiders, but rather the family policy is still important, but we still need more emphasis on the quality of the jobs that women enter into when they enter the labor market. So there has been emphasis on how to increase the employment rate amongst women, and that has been one of the key directives of the European Union. But what these findings show is that we actually need to emphasize more on the quality of the jobs as well. And at the end of the day, once they enter the labor market, the jobs available when they want to balance work and family may be the dead-end jobs that we found in this research. So, and also the policies that do not disrupt existing gender norms may in turn either maintain or enhance it, which builds upon the literature that already exists on the unintended consequences of family policies or welfare state paradox. Lastly, as we saw from the typical outsider jobs, these are the young workers who are also not necessarily more likely to be mothers or fathers, but we saw more women belonging to this group. And this tells us that actually the women's higher likelihood of being outsiders are not just limited to the mothers. So a lot of the gender equality policies has been more or less focusing on supporting motherhood in the recent years, but we also need to focus more, we also need to emphasize the fact that there still is the gender inequalities that exist among the younger workers, especially when they enter the labor market. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hoyjin, for that fascinating research. Our last presenter today, our fifth presenter, is Nicole Dillard, Assistant Professor of Human Resource Development at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen okay? Okay, great. So this presentation today highlights a body of research within my agenda that has multiple scholarly outputs and serves the purpose of invoking a deeper commitment of reproductive justice or commitment to reproductive justice within my home discipline of critical human resource development. So what is explored are three guiding questions related to critical HRD research, theory, and practice that help situate reproductive justice within the disciplinary priorities. Let's see. So these questions here are really at the heart of who we are as a discipline in terms of our theoretical foundations. Number two, our research in terms of how it is that we know who we are. And then number three, our practice, right? As practitioners of critical HRD, what it is that we do, how we do it, and the history of the doing, particularly in relation to the advocacy of reproductive justice. And these questions really respond to some of the pushback within the discipline to engage radically in reproductive justice advocacy. What will be discussed today, due to the fact of time, is this third guiding question, number three, which is related to the practice in response to the critique that reproductive justice advocacy is just not what we do in HRD, right? And that this particular guiding question seeks to really interrogate this claim by illustrating that, in fact, we as HRD practitioners, particularly critical HRD practitioners, have been doing reproductive justice work. But because we have, within the discipline, limited and broader narratives, limited our work focus on abortion and choice and life debates, we can't see how a more comprehensive framework for reproductive justice is critical to the work within critical HRD. So before addressing the questions, I want to start with a baseline of understanding the terminology used across this research, particularly related to our framework for comprehensive reproductive justice and critical HRD. So for the framework, I leveraged the work of Sister Song, which is a women of color collective that organizes around reproductive justice. And they define their framework around comprehensive reproductive justice as situating four characteristics, right? So essentially the first is the right to bodily autonomy, and these are discussed as human rights. Human right to bodily autonomy, the right to parent in safe and sustainable communities, the right to either birth or parent with dignity, and the right to have or not have children. They position this framework as a model that is situated not only in reproductive justice, but also within social justice and human rights. In terms of defining critical human resource development, we understand that CHRD was conceptualized to guide HRD broadly back to its humanistic roots of principles around ethics of care, specifically that prioritize the development, the care, the dignity, and the lives of the individuals over the organizations and the systems and structures of management. And related to the critical work we do within DEI, and also in context to some of the advocacy related to reproductive justice, critical HRD was developed to question issues related to power, interests, structures of oppression, and issues of equity. In aligning critical HRD to this comprehensive framework for reproductive justice, we really honed in on both of the foundations within the humanistic principles. So the highlighted areas on the screen in yellow that you see are the areas of alignment that we have found between this comprehensive framework for reproductive justice and the goals and priorities of critical HRD. And we sought to really center these major highlighted areas of alignment, which you see at the bottom of the screen, around the ethics of care, compassion, autonomy of one's life, standing in opposition to oppression, which we have characterized as related to elements of quality of life. So within this idea of understanding the alignment around life, and in the context of the three social political movements that I'll discuss later in the presentation, we sought to categorize the governmental actions, particularly in this case related to the US government, around being counter to quality of life and counter to life, right? And so we conceptualized many of the actions taken by the US government during these three social political moments in restricting access to marriage equality, restrictive immigration policies, and COVID-19 as elements of state-sponsored harm. And so when we talk about harm, we're talking about the cases in which both harm and death, whether that's social death or physical death, were perpetrated on behalf of the US government. And I'm using Matthews and Kolorovich's definition of state-sponsored harm, which has three categories, right? The kind of the typical idea of state harm or state crimes that we understand of, like explicit violations of codified law, in addition to state crimes that technically don't violate a codified law, but are universally understood to be violations. So this would be like violating the spirit of the law. And then thirdly, the ways in which this is causing social harm. And so social harm is identified as the ways that governments, either by acts of omission or commission, curtail human potential. And so I'm able to situate this conceptualizing harm within the context of necropolitics, right? And necropolitics, as described by Ndimbe, is the ultimate expression of sovereignty, which resides in a large degree in the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. Right? It's when a nation state makes decisions to kill or allow to live, and is seen as an exercise of control over mortality, and to define life as the deployment of manifestations of power. So in these three social political moments, this harm was represented in the ways in which, one, the state controls who matters and who does not when they deny pathways to marriage equality. Two, in which the ways the state decides who is disposable through zero tolerance policies of separations of immigrant families. And three, while also controlling who lives and who dies from COVID-19 when systematically preventing access to care prophylactics. What will be discussed in the remainder of this presentation, however, is the hope that was provided when organizations and practitioners, particularly those within HRD, organized against in opposition to these actions of harm. And then those organizations has been described as elements of family work policy or social justice. But what I would like to seek to explore is the way that these organizational actions can be framed within advocacy for reproductive justice, particularly in relation to advocating for health, care, and life. And it's at this intersection that I'm seeking to align this comprehensive framework with reproductive justice within the critical HRD actions to advocate for greater organizational advocacy for quality of life. So for the sake of time, I'm going to, out of the three social political moments, I'm going to focus the conversation on a period of time between 2017 and 2018, where we saw an increase of restrictive immigration policies. So I argue that we can associate many of the organizational actions to counter the harm that was instigated or perpetuated by the US government as framed through the lens of reproductive justice. So in this question, I see the idea of HRD practice as most critical of the three questions because it actualizes who we are, how we know it is that we are actually advocates of reproductive justice by seeking to see how we do it on the ground and in real time and in the real world. And when I explore how we've done this work across organizations, I focus on four key elements within this specific moment of restricted immigration policy. One, how was the harm actually perpetuated by the state? Two, what were the organizational responses in opposition to these harms that worked in support of and advocating for their employees' reproductive justices and broader justices? And three, how these responses specifically supported the four characteristics of the comprehensive framework for reproductive justice and how it's relevant to the work that we do in DEI. So as you can see on the screen, I'm in this context of the restrictive immigration policies, I acknowledge that within the US, we have had a troublesome policy, anti-immigrant policies historically. But within this span of 2017 and 2018, we saw a significant shift in that policy that related to particularly two specific policies, the Executive Order 13769, which has become to be known as the Muslim ban, and then the 2018 zero tolerance policy of family separation. And this shift is significant during this time from other anti-immigration policies within the US, because what we saw was a movement from what has been described as slow violence, right? And slow violence is the ways in which policies harm, but in ways that are long-term, like through lengthy visa waits or secretive deportation or limited immigration pathways, right? These kind of actions of slow violence have been kept under the radar, are seen as not as violent as what we saw in 2017 and 2018, which has been described as spectacular violence towards family, right? And these issues of spectacular violence tend to be more recognizable as harmful and illicit because they've been executed against kids, because social media has been able to show us imagery of what's happening, right? So you think about spectacular violence as detaining of children in cages, instances of forced sterilization, monitored menstrual cycles and forced hysterectomies and abortions and things of that nature. And so due to the kind of the immediate discernibility of this spectacular violence, these policies have generated a wider spread critique across the society, but in particular within organizations as a collective call for action towards reproductive justice. So what we've seen in response to this harm by the organizations are examples where organizations finance the legal support of their employees to help them stay within the countries or to fight against any type of law enforcement citations. We saw a commitment of organizations like Starbucks to hire X amount of refugees and train refugees. We saw community organizations working to mitigate against law enforcement surveillance. So we saw institutions like universities training their staff on what not to disclose to law enforcement when they come. We saw instances where community organizations were working in an organized fashion to provide medical service to immigrant populations in a way to avoid the surveillance of ICE agents, right? So these mobile clinics, these ideas of these mobile clinics, when ICE agents will come to facilities that people could seek healthcare, particularly OBGYN healthcare in mobile clinics. And so I seek to frame these responses by the organizations as not just policies that are within a broader context, but that they have implications and can really be aligned to understanding how organizations have maybe unknowingly supported reproductive justice, right? When we think about these four characteristics of reproductive justice, we can explain these responses within each of them, right? We position an organization financing legal fees to allow its employees to physically stay in the country as a support of bodily autonomy, right? Supporting me physically being able to stay in a place where I can live and support my family. And the access and providing OBGYN care to mobile clinics is also related to bodily autonomy, the support for bodily autonomy. Similarly, when we think about commitments to hire and train refugees so that they're able to provide economically for their children and their families, that supports the reproductive justice right to birth and to parent one's children with dignity. And finally, as we think about the ways that organizations work to mitigate the surveillance of immigrant bodies, we can associate that with the call within our comprehensive reproductive framework to provide the right to live and to raise a family in a safe and healthy and sustainable environment. And of course, the implications to our work as DEI practitioners and researchers, can be a myriad of areas within a myriad of areas, but I have, highlighted on the screen the relationship to diversity of religion and culture and our inclusion of immigrant communities within the fabric of life. So in conclusion, I have this context on the screen from one of our articles that really seeks to talk about the ways that organizations are going to need to step up in this current climate where there is lack of trust within the government, lack of clarity around information as being true or valid or real, and then the role that the government is not supporting the social in the way that we have called for it to be. Right. So as we think about modern corporations and organizations as replacement for the states in terms of taking care of its citizens, I position critical HRD as a potential leader to do this work to advance reproductive justice specifically, but social justice more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for sharing your crucial work with us. We now have quite a bit of time for questions and discussions. So if you'd like to ask a question, it would be great if you could raise your virtual hand in Zoom and we will call on you. I guess I can get us started with one question for the first presenter, Sylvia. If I understood your findings correctly, it seemed that you found that being furloughed mattered a lot more for mothers from high-risk families compared to mothers from other families. I was wondering if you might be able to unpack, perhaps why that might be the case for us.
That's such a great question. And the short answer and the true answer is I don't really know. So because it is quite a dramatic difference. And furlough is basically being temporarily laid off. It was common at the very sort of beginning of the pandemic, and our measures were like, has this ever happened to you, right? Did you experience this? And so for most people, it probably happened at the beginning, that initial stage of the pandemic where, businesses were shutting down, they were closing for a period of time, and where people were sort of, temporarily laid off. So I'm not sure why that would be more negative for mothers in high-risk families. So I looked at, it didn't seem like that there was sort of like obvious differences. I would say that overall there's the mothers in high-risk families who have been furloughed were more likely to be out of the labor market or not employed later on. But I do control for that in the model. So that's net, that's net of after accounting for the fact that it was more likely to, sort of end up in more prolonged exclusion from the labor market for those mothers. And the differences weren't super dramatic to start with. And of course, I'm already also accounting for perceptions of career prospects, right? So, what you might think about that in terms of your potential career prospects. So I'm not really sure is the short answer. And I'm if anybody has any great ideas about that, I'm certainly open to hearing it. I think it might have something to do with maybe differences in that experience of being furloughed, where perhaps, and here's part of the ambiguity also in terms of like how we really understand early in the pandemic, how those experiences were classified, right? So when I look at the broader research we've done, looking at sort of parental labor market patterns over the pandemic, we find that, mothers' employment, at least initially, was much more impacted than fathers' employment. And it wasn't because they were saying that they left their jobs for family-related reasons, but was very much tied to, the lack of school and childcare and so forth, but because they're more likely to have been laid off. Well, I think what was happening is that employers were laying off mothers, but, they were laying them off because mothers are saying, I can't do this. My kid's not in school. My kid's not in care. So it was being classified as a layoff, even though it was essentially for family related reasons. Nobody was saying it was for family related reasons. So I think there might be a somewhat similar dynamic that's going on there, where for mothers in high-risk families, either because their own circumstances, they're the high-risk person, or their kids, or their partner, they were more likely to have their employers lay them off, or to have their employers furlough them. So I'm guessing that it's probably that it was more tied to that high-risk family status for them versus just the general business conditions, and then your employer brought you back on. For other mothers, and that having it be tied to, the health status in that way creates greater stress and insecurity about what the implications are for, your ability to continue to manage your employment, particularly as the pandemic goes on and you're dealing with these increased health risks. So that's my sense, but it's difficult with our data to really get at that for sure.
Great, thank you so much, Sylvia. And I see Joya has her hand raised.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the speakers. This has been so wonderful, and a really diverse panel that has given me lots to think about. My question is for Professor Shou. I'm really curious about the analysis of family policies and outsiders that you did. And I'm curious about two things. So one thing is that it seems like when I look at that kind of graph of, from kind of less to more, what I'm also seeing is countries that have more of a full-time employment base and ones with more part-time jobs. And so I'm kind of curious how you see that playing out, because I suspect there's something beyond the family policies and kind of more about the way work time is set up. The other thing is that when you were talking about outsiders, I kept thinking of migrants. And I was kind of curious how you see the migrant workers and gender intersecting in how people are kind of more or less included in the labor force. I'm definitely thinking very much from a dualization kind of framework, and I'm kind of curious if that fits with you, the way you see this.
Thank you so much for these questions. And I have to say that my research was very much based on your research. So I feel really grateful that I get this question from you as well. So I think what I can tell you at the moment is that actually the idea behind these four different types of jobs actually derived from the dualization theory. And it was initially, the idea was to actually bring in gender perspectives to this theory, and then how we can actually look at the labor market in a more to understand the complexity of the labor market instead of just looking at it in terms of standard and non-standard employment. Because for women especially, the income issue is more important, the part-time is more important of an issue, and also the lack of prospects for advancement was more of an issue, especially considering the life course perspective. So that's why I incorporated all those different types of different indicators to identify how the labor market then would be divided if we take into account all those different indicators. So part-time is indeed one of them. I think when I showed the findings, it wasn't very clear, but it was for the typical outsiders and the dead-end insiders who were more likely to be part-time workers at the same time. So the part-time work and income level, low income was quite the distinct characteristics of those two groups who are also more likely to be women at the same time. As to the migrants, it's something that I did not focus so much on in this particular research. They are included as a control variable in the individual level of analysis, but I didn't look into it so much. My hunch would be that a lot of women would, I don't think many of the migrant workers who are in the care sector especially would be captured through this survey. It would be very difficult to actually capture them through this bigger European level survey, I think. So, but the people who would be captured probably will belong to either the typical outsider or the dead end insider jobs. That would be my guess. But how they intersect with families something that I really cannot say at the moment. But thank you so much for this question. I'll think more about it. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. Do we have other questions in the audience? Oh, I see Sylvia has a question. If you'd like to go ahead with your question, that would be fantastic.
Hi, my question is for Nicole and Yang. So I think your research is super interesting, and kudos on you for taking on such an important and challenging topic. And I guess the question was about causality, and I may have just missed it because everybody's going over everything so fast, and it's early for me, and I'm maybe not adequately caffeinated to really follow. And so apologies if I'm missing this. But Yang, you mentioned something about causality, and I guess the thing that I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around, of course, is that if I understand this correctly, you're looking at sort of the characteristics of these job ads, and then you're looking at just like the general characteristics of the labor market, the occupation in industry representation as your outcome variable. And as you acknowledge, there's sort of a lot of bidirectionality that we would expect to be going on there. But you did have this, you had this kind of flyaway mention of, how you were accounting for causality, but I don't think you gave details on that. And so I'm curious as to if and how you're managing that or thinking about that. Is this something to do with the degree to which that first slide, you have sort of an online, emphasis in the job ads in general for the industry, or how? It's such a tricky question. So I'd like to hear more about how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, and can I say a high level point on this, and then do you want to go into some of the more technical stuff that we've tried?
Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, so I think for the causality question to me is one of the most interesting and also most frustrating, because I think there's two ways you could approach this. One, are you seeing social reproduction, right? So are job advertisements simply a reflection of the composition of the labor force, and people write job advertisements in a way that reproduce how they think of their jobs, how they think of themselves as workers? Or are you seeing something that is, truly causal? We have come up with this ad, and we're attracting this different workforce as a result of that. So I think I was a little bit more agnostic at the beginning of this. I think a social reproduction story is very interesting. And so can we model social reproduction, and how would we do that? How does that look differently from a causal story? But the causal story is what people sort of want, in these discussions, how causal is this? If we're going to do an intervention, how can we do that in a way that's supported by causally robust models? So I guess what I'll say is I think both processes are interesting, but I'll leave it to Yang to talk more technically about how we're trying to address it. And it's an ongoing process is the short answer.
Yeah. Thank you, Sylvia, for this question. Really interesting question. So that's precisely the part where we are currently working on, trying to disentangle some of the complex causal issues. We are going several directions. We are fitting a non-recursive models, trying to tease out instrumental variables, trying to tease out some of the relationships going on in there. And we're also looking to the long-term labor market change to look into a before digitalization, to give us the kind of time lag that will allow us to tease out some of the issues we are looking at. At the same time, you are hitting it on the nail. We are looking at the level of digitalization to see how that's playing a role as well. That's a big moderator, and we are interested in testing. So at the moment, we don't have a very conclusive answer yet. Our partial analysis that's still ongoing is indicate that direction is going both ways, but we are not yet able to give everybody a very conclusive answer as to which way the effect might be stronger and how it is going. Thank you.
Wonderful. I see Melissa has a question.
Hi, everyone. Such wonderful and rich, amazing presentations. I have a lot of questions, but there was one in the chat, Krista, that you might want to take. I think I still have time for mine, but if you want to look at that, that would be great. I really, especially for Professors Gudeta and Dillard, I'm really thinking about like how people feel that they matter. I think Sylvia used the word mattering in the presentation, like who matters in society, right? And how workers and carers are feeling, like the uncertainty and the lack of hope, I think, right, in the Ethiopian workers' stories, and then like a Muslim ban, and who, like, just how little that message of like the societal, the cultural, like who's in and who's out. And I also love that language of the insider outsider. But I wondered, and also in relation to the question in the chat, like, have we thought about, or can you think about how the people cared for fit into your work, whether it's the children or people with disabilities, or, you know, it's mothers you're looking at work, but how are the children involved? How are they thought of in your work, and so on? So it's kind of a broad question, but I don't think we think enough in our efforts on DEI about those who are being cared for, whether they're elderly, children, those with disabilities, and so on. So it's kind of an open question, but I was thinking in particular across the presentations, if anyone wants to respond.
And I would just very quickly add, like Melissa was saying, there is a question in the chat that I think you could integrate into your response to Melissa's question. And this question is from Tina Peterson, and it states, my research focuses on older grandparents raising grandchildren and hypertension in African-American women family caregivers. How do older workers with family caregiving responsibilities fit within the issues discussed within these papers? It seemed that most populations emphasized younger to middle-aged adults. So I think that can kind of be folded in and maybe addressed together. So is there anyone that wants to jump in first and address these questions?
Maybe if I go first to address some of the issues Professor Melissa raised. With the women that we have asked, particularly looking at their well-being, we wanted to see the overall well-being, because we know we understand that it's not only the experiences at the workplace that matters, but also the women's experiences, roles, responsibilities, and expectations in the family, and particularly in the Ethiopian context, also in the community, because these women have roles as a neighbor and also as a community member in different neighborhood associations and other like extended family members and others, expectations that arising from there as well, that impacts directly or indirectly their well-being. But one thing I might have rushed into discussing some of the findings and not a few not represented here as well. but they consider family a very important aspect, central to their well-being, and whatever the women aspire to get in terms of material, it's not, they often describe it not for them, but to be able to improve the life of the family. So I often describing it that I want to be able to arrive here, reach this goal, so that I can be able to provide for my family, so that I can be able, not only the nuclear family, but also maybe parents, because that's a norm, that's expected, what's expected from a child, a daughter, and all. So the family comes into the picture, but for few of the women, having children that they need to care for adds extra additional challenge for these women, because they are earning very low wage. They cannot afford to send them to, you know, the daycare or any other services are practically non-existent in this environment. So it's a very, it requires a community for them to raise these children, maybe parents, and also maybe even neighbors sometimes taking care of these women's children. And the family comes into the picture in this aspect. And in terms of visibility, the women often feel that they are not visible for those. They don't feel that they matter, but they are not adequately cared for, and not by the managers, not by the organizations, and also not in the policies, governmental policies and others. Thank you.
I can also share within the context of my research around, mattering and through the lens of care. I talked about, one of the social political moments that I've researched regarding to immigration, but a second is that I discuss is, the impact of harm around to marginalized communities throughout COVID-19. And, in relation to this idea of care, I use this phrase of prophylactics as care. So Stephen Thrasher has this framework in his, if you haven't read, he has this phenomenal book called The Viral Underclass. And he draws some parallels between the way government responses to marginalized communities during the height of the HIV/AIDS pandemic to similar practices of during COVID-19 in ways that limited care to marginalized communities. And, in thinking about how we historically in the US have talked about prophylactics as, measures to mitigate against disease. And we normally talk about them like physical measures, right? Like condoms or face masks, or pharmaceutical measures like vaccines, right? But in this broader, one way to think about how care, or even the opposite of care, harm is done in marginalized communities, is to expand how we understand prophylactics as care, right? Beyond the physical and the pharmaceutical. So he introduces prophylaxis through this lens of not only physical and pharmaceutical, but seeing conceptual prophylactics, right? Freedom to opportunities, right? And how those opportunities, whether that's employment, childcare, access, also serve as measures of maintaining health within particularly marginalized communities. He also talks about care, prophylaxis of care as freedom from obstacles, right? So thinking about how our policies around mitigating disease should also address obstacles to care, right? So how, especially what we saw in COVID, the discrimination practices, the inequity across social identity categories and in various ways, various structures within the healthcare system. So I think that, even thinking about the question in the chat of older populations or more vulnerable populations, you can see the impact on those populations of harm when you use this framework. I can think about examples of, New York State policies, right? So if you wanted to get a free vaccine, you had to have a phone and scan this code or go to a link to set up an appointment. And so when you think about access of care, you can automatically see how that is disproportionately affecting marginalized communities, whether that's older populations who can't manage the technology, whether that's folks who have housing insecurity and can't access, technology, whether that's folks who can't afford pay phone bills to be able to scan codes or whatever, right? So, but the idea is that when we look at care through this and prophylactics through this more comprehensive lens, we're able to see more the gaps in relating to care and the harm that's happening, particularly around marginalized communities who already historically feel like they don't matter.
I might jump into it. Thank you, Nicole. I really appreciate everything you said there. I think it was wonderful. And I might jump in with a couple of sort of additional reflections. One of the things that there's sort of two, so many things I want to say. So the first thing, I just want to kind of build on what you're saying there and thinking about this sort of notion of mattering and thinking about like necropolitics and who we, who we see and who we don't see. I had another slide that I was going to put up, and I didn't put it up at the end because it's a little bit in your face, and there's always this really difficult position. And I will say that I am someone in a high risk family. My husband is a transplant recipient, so I have lived this experience through the pandemic, and there's always this like, how do you get people to care? Right? Because when anytime, and as I have throughout the pandemic, I've tried to advocate for more protections, advocate for greater inclusion, not just for myself, but for others, it has often not been received very well. It's been received as that you're the problem. The complainer becomes the problem, right? You're a killjoy, and it's a difficult position to be in, to be the one who's impacted and also asking, right? And I would say that there's been a lot of sympathy and there's been very little solidarity in my personal experience of navigating this, navigating the pandemic, right? It's been up to me to fight and to push throughout. There's been not a lot of other people doing that. And so one of the things that really I think has been most harmful has been seeing the ways in which people made vulnerable by the pandemic have been like really framed in a way that dismisses their death and their social death, their absence, as unproblematic, so that there was just recently in the U.S. context here, this MD, Master's of Public Health, testifying to the U.S. House Subcommittee says, has any young healthy child died in the United States of COVID? Now, of course, the answer is yes, lots. 20% of the children who died had no comorbidities. But just the question itself, right, implies that the deaths of children who aren't healthy are not something that we should be concerned about. Another tweet from another, MD, Master of Public Health person. So again, thinking about like who's putting out these things, saying, if you're not up to date on your vaccines, and if you get treated, if infected, this was on Twitter, your chances of surviving COVID is close to 100%. Those are the facts. The rest is noise. Who is noise? Right? People like my husband are noise. We don't count. A transplant recipient who died, there was our CBC, our main national public broadcaster, did a sort of a profile. But the whole way that the article was framed was like, oh, well, he spoke against lifting pandemic rules to protect the vulnerable. He died after contracting COVID-19. Yes, it showed that he couldn't protect himself. Care worker came in, whatever. But it was all framed about, well, he was vulnerable. He had these health conditions, and none of the rest of us need to worry. So there's just this persistent framing, right, of like literally whose lives matter and whose inclusion matter. And this extends to older adults, right? So, older adults are also a group that's at higher risk. There's a very clear age gradient. And throughout the pandemic, they have been dismissed. Their lives have been devalued. And we're not, they're really largely, continue to be largely invisible. And then the second point that I wanted to say is what I think is a real, failure of a lot of the policy around the pandemic has been to actually to decontextualize and to pull more vulnerable people we know to be more vulnerable, because lots of people are vulnerable, they don't necessarily know it, out of their family context and out of their household context and out of their community context. Part of this is like, we're not there anymore, so you don't see us, so you don't have to think about us, right? But it's also, in my province, no more boosters for people who aren't immunocompromised. Well, I'm not immunocompromised, but if I get COVID and I give it to my husband, that's a huge freaking problem, right? schooling arrangements for children. There's no, there's no consideration that, okay, well, your child might be healthy, but they might live with an older adult. They might live with a grandparent. And we know this is more common in immigrant families, for example. They might live with someone who's immunocompromised, but it's all been about, well, we don't have to worry about kids. And so therefore we don't need to worry about whether they get COVID or whether they spread COVID. So there's been this sort of disembedding of vulnerable people from families and from the broader society that is really, problematic just from a practical policy perspective. And it also contributes to the sort of the social isolation and the invisibilization of folks, particularly in the stage of the pandemic we're in now, where we have ongoing high transmission, but people have been encouraged and admonished to not care about getting and transmitting COVID, right? You do you. We have this neoliberal approach. It doesn't matter so long as you are healthy, whether you get it, whether you spread it, without a consideration that this actually just continues to shut more vulnerable people out of meaningful engagement and inclusion in society. And I will say that, one of the big disappointments of the pandemic for me has been seeing how little even people who are sort of institutionally mandated to care about and be representatives on EDI committees actually care about inclusion. That the inclusion part of EDI has been just, I mean, I can't really say it politely, what I really want to say, but it's been pretty glaringly absent in my experience.
Thank you, Sylvia. Lots to think about for all of us. I wanted to give the other two presenters a chance to weigh in on that question if they wanted to before we close.
Can I add just a very quick comment, because Sylvia, what you mentioned is really very inspiring and insightful. So in our project, we have been constantly thinking about who is seen and unseen, who's visible and invisible in the digital age. So when we are looking at the algorithms and we are working with job platforms and CV screeners who rely on artificial intelligence to do all of those jobs, that's the issue we're picking up here. And they just really don't distinguish between the different nuances and intersectionalities we are talking about. It's an average prediction that's being done by artificial intelligence. And its average prediction not only reproducing what Nicole just said in terms of the labor market structure, it's a reproduction story, but at the same time, it's reproducing what kind of knowledge we are inputting into it, what kind of perspective are we inputting our knowledge. So it's really important for us to think about where work-family research stands in relation to the very massive digitalization, artificial intelligence movement, because that's not part of even the design of those artificial intelligence architecture in the first place. So what we found in the first place is that the word embedding, training algorithm, they don't pick up any of those work-family issues when we are talking about gender and race. That's really important for us to put all of those concerns and considerations into that equation. Quite often that requires cross-disciplinary collaboration and thinking. So we reach out from our field and break down some of the barriers in thinking about some of those issues. I know time is ticking, but I'll
add one thing to Yang, and kind of building what Sylvia said, is it's not always an easy process. So, I mean, by design, our grant was to put us in conversation with computational statisticians, mathematicians, CS people, and management. And so part of the inclusion part of this is having challenging conversations with people from different disciplines to incorporate those insights. And it's not always perfect or easy. And so I think recognizing that is a scholarly and personal challenge, and that's ongoing in these types of work is really important. And just as a second aside, to say thank you for Sylvia for your public advocacy for inclusion during the pandemic, especially in the Canadian university context. But that's an aside, and thank you.
No, I'll just quickly add, I don't have much to add about what regarding my research, but I also wanted to thank Sylvia for sharing and also for all the comments and questions that was raised. It just allowed me to actually rethink about some of the things that I was thinking about. And because I often use a very big quantitative data, I think those are the things that we miss out on. And this is something that I will have to think about. And I have to say, I really learned a lot today. And I guess I'm really happy that we can continue talking about this as an EDI community. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for all your insights and wonderful presentations. And I think that we can all move forward trying to find ways, I think, to make the invisible visible. I think that's a theme that came through today. And there's so many different ways to do that, you know, and especially like Sylvia was saying, as we're living through a global pandemic that has big influence on people's work family lives. So thank you everyone for being here today, and take care, and we'll see you at the next virtual conference series event.